Hello and welcome to this episode of FireDEV, a fireside chat with great people in the industry. Today I've got Stephen Sowole here, and he's worked at a bunch of companies. One of the companies I want to talk about first is the company Giphy that he worked at. Like, what was that interview process like? And what did you do there? I also, want to say, welcome onto the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and good morning from the States. It's pretty early here. But yeah, I can go straight into it. So, first question is, what was the interview process like? Well, it was a little unorthodox. It was at the time that I was joining, it was still a startup, well, very much early startup. So, when I had a chat with the CEO, there were probably like 10 people, and they were under this sort of incubator slash accelerator sort of entity called BetaWorks up in New York. I had a friend who happened to be working at one of those companies, so he gave me an intro to Giphy, and so they sort of like flew me out. Like it was a pretty casual interview. It was more of a sort of cultural interview as per like a technical interview at first initially, which is like most places. But because it was still small, I just spoke with the CEO directly, Alex Chung, and it took about like maybe like an hour. Just sort of figuring out like what my motivations were, what I wanted. I was like pretty much finishing university at the time, so I didn't really have any interest in working in the UK, honestly. I just kind of wanted to work in the US. That was always sort of my goal. Always wanted to sort of be in the sort of the front line of the tech scene, which is what I thought at the time. So I flew out to kind of meet everyone in person. And once I got over to the office, I sort of got to meet the team, got to sort of chat about things on a more technical level. I think the CEO at the time only had he was the only one that had like iOS experience. So I was coming on to be an iOS developer. And so we had a technical conversation. I got to see sort of like how things are working, what I sort of what I would sort of be taking over. And at the time, it was sort of like a really big sort of thing for me because I was coming straight from uni. I hadn't had like work experience like that before. I had experience sort of like building companies, but not necessarily working in a sort of startup or corporate environment that wasn't my own. So it was really sort of interesting to sort of experience that. So the interview process was sort of straightforward, sort of unorthodox in terms of I didn't have to answer sort of any algorithmic questions or anything of that nature. It was more of like a practical test where it's like, okay, show me how you would think through building something like this or like this, or like how are you sort of, let's see your actual code, let's see, you know, how you behave with the team, those sorts of things. And I just came in to sort of inherit, let's say, the entire sort of code base for iOS, and that was quite a sort of overwhelming experience because it was just me essentially. They were looking to hire iOS developers, but at the time that was like kind of the first initiative. So I sort of got in just as they were sort of thinking through that. So it was quite an experience, but definitely a lot of fun, if that answers your question.
Oh yeah, it does. I mean, I knew you worked at Jiffy, early on, in their journey, but I didn't realize it was that early when there's only 10 people there. I think it just shows that even because I think you started in 2015, it like back then I remember it had a pretty big reach already, and it's crazy that there's only 10 people there. I'm guessing that's 10 including like the CEO. So like that small startup had that big, reach that it did. The next question is, I mean, you've already alluded to it, but I'm going to ask you why effectively instead of how. Why do you pronounce it, Giphy instead of Jiffy? Because there is that debate, GIF versus GIF, and obviously how you pronounce that forms how you pronounce, I guess, the company name.
It was actually pretty funny because that was like kind of a running joke in the company, the pronunciation. I think they sort of settled on the hard G, so the Giphy, as opposed to the Jiffy. Um, Hilariously enough, they had a partnership with there's a peanut butter brand here in the US called Jif, and they had like a little collaboration at one point. But I think it was just a company decision. They just wanted to keep it Giphy. I just happened to call it Giphy at the time, so it sort of aligned with company values. So I didn't necessarily have to change too much about what how I was pronunciating it.
Okay. And like, were there ever any heated arguments over the pronunciation, or was it more of just like a fun joke within the company?
I feel like it was more of a fun joke. There were more heated arguments with the internet at the time because I think the 2015 period of Giphy's sort of life cycle was kind of like when things were just starting to blow up, and then no one knew
Mm.
how to like pronounce it, and there was just massive debates going on online as to whether it was Jiffy or Giphy or And so I'd say that the war was probably fought outside of the company as opposed to internally. Internally, it was, oh, okay, cool. Maybe like one or two people still called it Jiffy when they were coming on board, but overall, it was still just very much known that this is Giphy.
Okay.
I'm not sure
Fair
if that
enough.
played a part in the interview process. Maybe you called it Jiffy. They may
Yeah.
not have taken you on.
I mean, you never know. Imagine if they had a great candidate, and then literally at the end, they're like, "I would love to work for Jiffy," and they're like, "I'm not too sure about this guy anymore."
Sorry, I don't think this is the right place for you, mate.
Yeah. So whilst you was over there, what sort of technologies did you use? Because you was on doing an iOS development there, and on top of that, you was one of the first people doing iOS there. Like, and also on top of that question, did you sort of shape what they was going to be using? One, because they're a startup. Two, because the iOS team wasn't already established with multiple members.
Yes, I would say so. At the time, it was pretty much just me and a designer working on it. So it was like a really, really small team. We had like an outsourced team that was working on sort of this separate sort of app in the background, Giphy Cam at the time. But the sort of flagship app that was pretty much just me at the helms of it. And when I took it on, it had been sort of you know some of the app had been outsourced and they wanted to do a complete redesign from the ground up. So effectively, that was a task that was given to me. And I was super enthusiastic about it because I was just itching to kind of build really cool stuff. I was really sort of itching to get into the helms of it. And effectively it started off just being that. So it was about learning how to build an app from the ground up and sort of building it up. I'm kind of surprised, like looking back, it was kind of a really big risk that they decided to take. And I'm not sure how it was pulled off eventually. Pretty sure there were a whole ton of bugs that I'm not even aware about. But effectively that was sort of the big thing for me. It was a big rewrite of the app, so we weren't keeping any of the code. And I think at one point, I think 2015 was a time that Swift had come out, so we were switching between Objective C and Swift. So it was about sort of like really sort of understanding the sort of the transitions between the two programming languages and sort of building that experience from essentially just the ground up completely. um, that was probably the biggest thing. And then there was also sort of the side products as well outside of the flagship app, which is I think it was at the time it was the Giphy keyboard. So that was a really 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 interesting project because there was almost no reliable documentation on how to build a good GIF keyboard. So I had to take on that as well, being a sole developer on it. And it was really interesting because things would break and you wouldn't like there would be no sort of way to sort of figure out why things were breaking. So all of the instrument tools, all of the sort of debugging tools really didn't really didn't exactly tell you why the app would crash like 2 minutes into usage, and you had to like sort of find out for yourself that it was memory leaks, or there was like because gifs were really sort of memory intensive, that when you take those gifs and you put them into the Giphy keyboard, which had like a memory constraint of like a maximum of 50 megabytes running at any one time, but a single GIF could be up to 15, and you also have to account for the fact that you have to leave space for the keyboard in there as well. It was just a nightmare. So that was definitely a really insane challenge to sort of pull that off. But in the end, that ended up being a successful product, and that was really great. I am not going back to building keyboards again, unfortunately, because of that experience. But yeah, effectively, it was just building iOS from the ground up, building the iOS app from the ground up, building the Giphy keyboard from the ground up. Also managed to squeeze in an Apple Watch app in there as well. So it was really a lot of fun. It was really, really a lot of fun.
So on the keyboard at that stage, was that just you, or had the team expanded a little more? And was it, or and if it was just you, was it you and that designer? What was that sort of setup like for the keyboard?
So there was actually another person that was working on the keyboard at the time, but they didn't have iOS experience. So they were sort of like a back end person that just wanted to kind of build a Giphy keyboard just as a, you know, as a one off. Like, hey, we have a competitor that has a keyboard, lots of downloads. Why don't we just build this keyboard? But there were a lot of sort of nuances to iOS. So it ended up taking a lot longer than expected, and it was pretty buggy and pretty unreliable. So then I sort of came onto the project, and it was like, okay, rebuild this from the ground up, and like let's make it little bit better. And so when I came on and sort of took that on, yes, it effectively just ended up being me and a designer, the same one that had like sort of given out the designs for the or mocked out the designs for the flagship ship app. So yeah, to answer your question, ended up being me and a designer, effectively.
Yeah, and after working on the keyboard and all those troubles that you had and everything that you learned from it, like how did that sort of shape your design and development sort of methodology and the way you do things going forwards, even if it wasn't directly keyboard related, just because a lot of apps, you have some sort of input, you click it, keyboard pops up, like because you was in the nitty gritty of dimensions of the keyboard, all that sort of stuff. Like, did it form your design decisions on other areas?
It's kind of hard to say because there are just your design decisions, the way you think about building software sort of changes as you sort of get more experienced or as you start to build more complex systems. But I think specifically related to the keyboard, there were very specific challenges that didn't necessarily translate to other parts of our sort of iOS product line. And even the fact that you have to think about the keyboard. So I'm not sure how much you know about like the keyboard APIs, but the way it works is Apple doesn't actually give you access to its own keyboard. So you effectively either have to build out your own keyboard or you have to use a library. And so there are ways that you have to effectively like hack it all together to make it work. And I'm not really a big fan of like hacking things together, but in that instance, that's the only way to kind of get it working. So in terms of design, you just really learn how to build a very specific sort of infrastructure that works for the keyboard API within iOS itself. But a lot of it doesn't necessarily translate outside, to, like to the flagship app or sort of other sort of apps that we were using at the time. It was just very much so. This is a very specific design pattern for the keyboard, and you know, not much could be translated outside to the main app. But as I was working on the main app, that's when I sort of like picked up like little things here and there. I was like, oh, okay, I could do it this way, or I could do it that way. And because iOS was still pretty much relatively new at the time, there were all of these sort of big changes that were happening in the community in terms of like how to write code or sort of like architecture decisions. So we would go from doing MVC, which is the model view controller, to there's this like new way of doing things, which is MVVM, which is model view model. Um, because you would essentially have these big parts of the code base which were just all constrained to like one single class, and that yeah, fun times. So yeah, so I guess it was just more so. It was a very interesting time to be an iOS developer because so much was changing, and nothing had been proven yet. So everything was just kind of okay. Well, let's try this and let's see how it works. Or let's try this and see how it works. So it was very much an evolving, I'd like to say, ecosystem within the individual products themselves. So that's where a lot of the learnings came from.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy, when you say that, 2015 was still in the early days, but when you think about it, it at the time, 2015 or so, 7 years after, the App Store launched, felt like, oh, so many years have passed, it's so mature, and now we're in 2022. It was 7 years ago. So it was like just in, halfway through its life cycle. And obviously, you being there, working at a startup, actually seeing all the changes, happening, you can definitely appreciate that, a lot of it was very early days. And I'm guessing for a lot of stuff, even outside the keyboard, there probably wasn't the sort of documentation you probably needed, and you just had to just sort of figure things out.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about it that way because yes, it is 7 years, and it's actually funny. But in tech, as we know, like 7 years is a lot of time for things to change pretty rapidly. So where I consider now, like iOS is very much almost like a mature platform in terms of like it's very full fledged, and things are getting more solid. It wasn't until a few years in that people started to take on iOS that these big issues started to come about, especially the massive view controller, as people started to call it, where you just had like code that was just essentially constrained to one place. And that's when people started to sort of innovate. So I think the 7 year mark, or I think the 5 to 7 year mark, is when people really start to sort of change things around. It's like, okay, there are problems here. How do we solve it? How do we fix it? And that's when, like I mentioned before, like the move to Swift happened as well. So there was a lot of, it almost felt like iOS was growing up and it was going through this adolescent stage or this, teenage stage where it really, anything could happen and it was really growing into itself. And so being a part of that and seeing those changes was very, very interesting, especially working at a startup where you had to sort of move fast. It wasn't a code base that had already existed for years prior. It was very much a new code base that had to be prepared for the changes that were coming up over the next few years. I think specifically with the keyboard API, I actually had to speak with, with Apple engineers because it was just a mess. Like the documentation will tell you that you call this class and something would happen, and it just wouldn't happen. And so I had to find out that like they just didn't maintain it the way it was. I think with a lot of the APIs at the time, you effectively had like one or two people that were like working on the entire sort of API. And once you have a small team working on a API that like millions of people could potentially use, yeah, it doesn't work very well. Things get left in a backlog, and you never get to it, and things just don't work as you expect. Whereas I think now it's different. Sort of all of the main APIs. I'm not sure how the keyboard API works right now, but a lot of the main APIs are now sort of like fully featured. Have entire sort of roadmaps dedicated to them. But I know like the watch API at the time and the keyboard API, all of the sort of the sub APIs outside of the main UI kit within iOS just weren't really maintained to the same sort of standard, and that made things pretty difficult.
Oh yeah, because the Apple Watch, I think it came out in 2015 as well. So you were really using it, when it came out, and I'm guessing you must have been developing for first generation. I'm assuming, and because it would be like developing applications in 2008. I remember doing some iOS coding in 2008, having iOS books like from what are established, companies, and I remember going through them step by step. I was learning to code as well in general. I'd only started coding in 2008, so I was only a few months into coding in general. But I'm learning Objective C. In the early days, it's difficult as it is in terms of your development journey. But I remember going through books, following their instructions verbatim, and I remember just thinking it's just not working. And then when I would look at the solution, I would see I would like they missed so many things out. They just and these books would be called beginners. It wouldn't even be like some expert book, but they would like have one line of code, and then a few pages later they had 10 lines of code, but they've only shown you how to add half the lines of code. They just assume that with these lines you have to add these lines that you just know, and it was kind of, I think, because Objective C had been around for ages, and the people that wrote those books were Objective C developers, and they was like, yeah, that's just normal stuff for an Objective C developer, but it's not Objective C. This is iOS with Objective C. So yeah, I'm guessing it must have been like that for the Apple Watch, where it was just very sort of rudimentary with what you had to play with.
Yeah, definitely, very much so. You sort of had to get in there, fiddle around, and sort of figure things out for yourself. Because yeah, a lot of stuff was missed out, and there's a lot of stuff that hadn't shown up in like things like textbooks or Stack Overflow online, or just even people hadn't sort of come across, especially with some of the things that people were still experimenting with when it came to Apple Watch. There was this very much that notion that we don't know what is actually possible with Apple Watch. We don't know where the boundaries are. So people assumed when it first came out that like you could do all this stuff, and you sort of start to experiment, push against the boundaries, and then you realize that that's actually not how it works. So yeah, very much rudimentary.
Okay, and obviously you talked about Swift, Objective C, switching over to Swift. How was that transition for you after doing Objective C for a few years? Like, and which one do you personally prefer?
That's a good question. I think with Objective C specifically, that was the first language I sort of fell in love with, but it's also a very challenging language. So
I remember.
I remember sort of picking up a MacBook for the first time to learn how to build apps. I was super interested in building apps. I really wanted to sort of get into the helms. And when I when I first saw Objective C as a language, I wanted to throw up. It was just so horrible compared to what we'd been learning, especially in college or university at the time. Because we were in Java and we were doing Python, and those were sort of almost like pretty languages, as I would call
Mhm.
it, compared to Objective C. And then you get to Objective C, and then you just have brackets everywhere, and you have semicolons, and
And pluses and minuses. I was like, what
um,
the hell is that? Because
yeah,
I came from doing Visual Basic first, and
yeah,
then trying to do that whilst I'm still trying to learn Visual Basic and trying to learn how to become a coder. And I'm like, what the like everything now, having done C, C++, I look back at it and be like, okay, that's what this means. It's to do with scope, it's to do with this, private, public, all that stuff. But back then I was like you're saying, what's all these brackets?
it was a whole mess. You had the headers, you had the header file, you had the implementation file, then you had like just it was a very strange experience, but I sort of committed to it and I dedicated myself to sort of figuring out how it worked. And I think in some ways, appreciate the language because of the high learning curve it took to sort of get to a good place with Objective C. And there's still probably some stuff that I don't actually know with an Objective C. It's been a while since I've built anything in that language, but I like it more so for the memory of what it is. But in terms of practicality, actually, that's sort of taken away from it as well. I do appreciate the fact that you have more control compared to Swift. Like with pointers and sort of memory management, like especially when you really want to build complex things, Swift is kind of not always like the most powerful, I should say. It's powerful as a language, but when you want to have like more control over how you handle memory or things like that, it gives you a lot of safeguards. So there'll be times when I was learning Objective C for the first time, I hate to admit it now, when things would crash, I would just like throw in a bunch of try catch statements. So just essentially just like a fail safe. Okay, well, if this crashes, I don't know, just stop the app from crashing. It was really bad programming design. But effectively, that's where I stand with Objective C. It's just this language that I really got to master and learn, the very first one. And so it has a special place in my heart. But as soon as Swift came out, at first I didn't want to sort of like adopt it. I wanted to see how the language sort of evolved. But I think it was about a year into Swift development that I sort of, decided, okay, well, now's the time to really get into it. Now's the time to really learn. And I really like Swift. I think right now, in terms of practicality, I really like Swift. Swift is really nice. Where it ended up, sort of like 3 years after they announced it, was just in a really good place. Because I know initially when it came to things like auto layout as well, when it came to what was it? I think it was the version of, I forget what it's called, the version of auto layout before its auto layout was a mess. Was it visual something language? I can't remember. Um, but yeah, Swift wasn't that much better when it first came out, but over time I began to sort of fall in love with it, and just all the safeguards and making sure everything like had type safety, and you couldn't just like turn anything into anything you wanted. Swift just became, and obviously Apple, it became the default programming language for Apple. So naturally, the more you use it, the more you get used to it, and the better it is, and vice versa. So yeah, I would
Yeah,
have to say Swift is the better programming language for me.
yeah. I mean, Apple definitely pushed Swift really, really hard, and it paid off. And I think the other thing I like about Swift is that it has like a Python Java kind of feel to it, but you can still access Objective C if you need to. You can still, go. You can put Objective C code in there, so you're not restricted because you can't put C++ code in Java or in Python.
Yeah.
Like you just can't do that. I mean, some platforms allow you to do some sort of layer that goes to native code, but again, that's I feel like that's just hassle for some small stuff. Whereas with Swift, yeah, you can just directly put Objective C code. Do you actually find yourself doing that often nowadays? Doing Swift and then finding that you're putting Objective C code, or do you try and go away from that?
No, I don't think I've written Objective C in years. So even in that scenario, there's always a way around it. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't ever feel the need to sort of inject Objective C into Swift.
Yeah, I think it's the scenario where it's useful is if, let's say, you've got a lot of custom libraries built in Objective C,
Yeah.
and it means you can use those libraries, create your new thing in Swift, and port them over time instead of being forced to port them from the start and potentially have buggy libraries, even though you
Yeah.
had established libraries. I heard a lot of people online talking about that use case where they had libraries and they was just using Swift, but then they was just using these existing code bases that they had, and then they was just updating them over time. So I think it definitely allowed people to get into it without having to fully commit, and I think that's probably what really made it successful for Apple.
Yeah, definitely agree there.
Yeah, and why did you leave Giphy and then ultimately go to Slack?
I think at the time I had one of one of my friends who happened to be working under the same incubator as me, the one that gave me the Giphy intro. He ended up moving to Slack, and he was sort of and Slack was interesting at the time. I guess I didn't really have any plans to leave Giphy, but I saw Slack as the opportunity to sort of really try something different. Um, I just gotten my H1B, so the way it works in the US is that you have different sort of visa categories. And when I moved to Giphy, I was like on a 1 year visa. It was called a J1, so it only gives you 1 year in the US. And once you're in the US, you have to apply for this other visa. It's more of like a permanent visa. It's like the H1B, which gives you 6 years. And so within those 6 years, you can apply for permanent residence. You can't do it on a 1 year visa. You have to get the H1B. And but the problem is that it's all lottery based. So you have a 20% chance once a year to sort of apply. And I applied with it through Giphy. I got it, so I was like really excited about that. And then the opportunity for Slack came up, and it just felt sort of a different. It felt like a different opportunity. That was also interesting. So right after I took a summer break and I came back, and I just sort of decided to try something new. And I think that's the sort of short story, I guess. Just more so wanted to try something new. My friend convinced me that Slack would be the company to work at. So I just wanted to try it. We were using Slack at the time, and it was also like a big, hot company. So I just figured, why not? Let me just take that take that sort of experience. But the only problem was that I was living in New York at the time, and Slack had their office in San Francisco. So I just decided that I didn't want to move to San Francisco. In all honesty, I very much love New York, but I just figured it would only be for a short time. So that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I remember Slack being. I mean, it's still obviously a very successful product. We've kind of become more established now. It's not quite team level in terms of it being established, but from a big company. But it is. It's just considered, a mainstream product almost now. Yeah, I remember it being like the thing. You got to use Slack. You got to use Slack. And I remember for ages, I just couldn't understand, what was so good about Slack, and partly because I never used it. And I remember
Mm.
a friend of mine's like, use Slack, use Slack, use Slack. And I remember thinking, like, what's so special about it? It's just a messaging thing. I've got Skype, I've got other services, and obviously, at the time, there was, Google based stuff as well, like Google Plus for Business. But when I used it, I understood. It was like, yeah, it's messaging, but it's just how well it works. And it's almost kind of not serious and enterprisey, and I think that's what was so good about it. It didn't feel like Skype for Business, which has obviously gone to Teams now. It
Yeah.
felt hacked together, but in a refined way. It felt like, oh, it's made by people that I want to hang out with, not some 40-year-old developer that isn't in touch with the way developers and teams work these days.
Yeah, it was very much well executed. I think that the target market was everything just worked very well in the moment for Slack. It was a very well executed product, target developers. So because like the sort of alternatives at the time were just sort of all over the place, or you just go to generic email. So it was just the perfect product for the perfect moment. And yeah, once you use it, it's like, oh, okay, I get it now. It makes sense. It's simple enough. It feels simple and complicated at the same time. Simple enough to use on a day-to-day basis, but when you need to sort of use the more complicated features, code snippets, you want to sort of share things to get like with people on your team, it's very much straightforward. And you can also have the sort of silliness. It has that sort of like cool feel to it where you can use it for both like serious work and when you just want to hang out and you just want to just send memes and stuff in channels. So it was a really great product when it came out. So
Yeah, definitely made it easy to be serious, but then also to goof around, and also the fact that plugins came out for it as well. Honestly, I've never looked into it. I don't know if Teams has any official way of doing plugins the way Slack does, but the way they work on Slack and how easy they are to get plugins for your Slack channel is so good. So you can get all sorts. You can get like a to-do list plugin. I thought that was great about it. It's like, okay, we don't have a to-do list built in, or it's not like the way you want it. Create a plugin. You just install a plugin or some sort of enhanced note-taking system. Install a plugin, and I think that's definitely something that it did really well compared to the others. And then I remember, obviously, similar sort of time period, maybe a little later, you had Discord as well, which was obviously heavily targeted at gamers, and then started going into obviously stuff with NFT, tokens now, but also business and also creating community. So it really did show that these two platforms that aren't taking themselves so serious, but have the good chat, but it's in a nice fun way. It's got a voice that overall works pretty well. I think Slack works better than Discord in my opinion. It's got video, and then you can have as many people as you want. It didn't have those tight restrictions that Skype did at the time. I remember with Skype, I think you could only have X amount of people you had to pay, or these other online services. So yeah, they definitely kicked it out of the park with just providing good features, providing a lot of features, and they were free to access or very cheap.
yeah, definitely agree. I definitely prefer Slack to Discord. That's my opinion, but I definitely prefer Slack to Discord. I think Discord feels very unorganized sometimes. It doesn't have as clean of an interface as Slack. So yeah,
Yeah, I feel like it's because obviously Slack was from the start oriented towards being business. Even if it's startup, it's still business and getting work done. And Discord was obviously for gamers. And I feel like as a result, because they've especially Discord has gone into other realms. I feel like Slack works still better than Discord does for their non-core stuff compared to Discord for their non-core stuff, because having a group on Discord and all the the spam issues that you have on there as well. But yeah, for work definitely I would go for Slack hands down. But I would be interested to just trial out Discord for a work-based setting, because I've heard a couple of people talk about that's what they use. But I've never tried it out for work. Have you tried it out for work specifically, or just in general?
no, I've only used it in general. Uh, yeah, I think it's just a general use case. I think that right now we're seeing the biggest sort of differentiation between Discord and Slack. Slack does feel like a work product, whereas Discord is very much tied to communities. It's actually harder to run a community on Slack especially because, like you mentioned, Slack is an enterprise tool. So when you have a, let's say, a 2,000 person community that wants to sort of, you know, run it on Slack, it's actually pretty hard, especially because of the way the payment structure works and the way that the free features are sort of distributed over time. And whereas Discord, everything is free from the get go, you know. So it definitely has its use cases. I think for me, I don't really use Discord for community based stuff. Like there are a few communities that I'm part of, but I, you know, being someone that always works, I, yeah, Slack is just more for me.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. So, what was New York like compared to California, and which one do you prefer and why?
Good question. New York is, what's the best way to describe New York? I've heard this being used quite a lot, but it's very much so like a London on crack. It's like what London would be if you just add more chaos to it. And I think that's what really makes it attractive to someone like me. I really love the city life. Growing up in London, it is very reminiscent of that. There's just tons of people. There's always stuff to do. There's always stuff going on until late. It's great. I like it. I like it. I love it. That was always my dream. My dream was always to move to New York, and when I had the opportunity, I took it in an absolute heartbeat. California is a little bit different. California is more on the sort of the chill side. So, it's always sunny. Like I think it rained here I think it was yesterday. Yeah, it rained yesterday, and that was the first time all year that I've seen like rain like that. So it's always this consistent nice weather, and I think people sort of respond like accordingly. It's just always nice, always friendly, but there isn't that much to do in terms of, or maybe specifically in San Francisco. And it feels very much work heavy. So most people that are in the city, like work, they just work within tech. So it feels very, what's the word? It feels like it has a very singular focus. So it wouldn't be as fun, in my opinion, as somewhere where like New York. So my preference is definitely for New York, but I can definitely appreciate San Francisco. I can definitely appreciate California. Within California, I actually prefer Los Angeles, which is like down south. That is more of like a really sort of nicer feel, nicer sort of vibe. There's more beaches, there's more stuff to do. But if you're interested in things like hikes, or you're interested in nature, or even skiing, things like that, San Francisco or the California is definitely the place to be. Um, so yeah, they're very different. It's very hard to compare, and I haven't met anybody who likes both New York and, let's say, California equally. There's always a preference just based on how polar opposite those two cities are.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. Obviously, one's a bit more hectic, more cramped, and obviously the way the people are. One's a bit more relaxed. People are a bit more chill. I feel like I probably would prefer California just based on how I feel about London. Like
Mm,
I visit London, and it's nice to visit for a few hours or a day or two. But then
yeah.
afterwards, I'm like, nope, because I worked there for a year, and I was like, nope. Everyone that says they want to live in London and they've never lived in London, I'm like, you think you want to live in London? You don't. You like the idea of it, but you don't want to be going on the underground day in, day out. Because it's not even like, even if you've got a car, it's just not practical in London. So it's not even that, oh, people can't afford cars. They got cars. It's just, and especially now with, all of the ultra low efficiency, efficiency zone, charges. Because me and my wife went to London the other week, and our diesel car was charged, and because we went to central London, it ended up costing us £27.50, which is what, about
Wow.
$30 just to drive to London.
Wow.
So just from that perspective, it's more practical to use, the underground. And because did you live in London when you was here? Was you from London?
Yeah, I'm from London originally. I didn't move back, so I went to Nottingham to do uni, and I never sort of went back. But
Mm.
well, went back to live. But it's always funny because people outside of London always have this very different experience going into London, and I almost forget because growing up in London, it's kind of what you're used to, and then you forget that like people outside of London don't have that experience, and it can be a very overwhelming feeling once you sort of visit. It's definitely not for everybody.
No.
And it's actually quite funny because everyone always says how like New Yorkers are really rude and like they're just like not great people, but when I went, it's almost like everyone that says that they've never actually lived in a place like London, because I think London is actually worse. People in New York are so friendly. People in
What,
America in general are really
what,
friendly compared to like Europe, you
what
know?
better than London? Because I remember London, the people were rude there.
Yeah, it's very different. I think London is very. I think the weather has something to do with it. It's the weather and just the density, and I don't think it makes a great mix for people's moods. Like, and I always used to hear about this, but no one really talks to you in London. Like, if you outside of like your friendship group, but you're not gonna have a random conversation with a stranger on the street just because that's a really weird thing to do. It's very conservative. Whereas out here in the US, that's a very commonplace thing. You meet so many people just because that's part of the culture. Everyone is super open. Everyone is very very into the idea of starting again, meeting new friends, like broadening your sort of your network. Whereas everyone in London's like, nope, I'm just here for work. I'm trying to get from one point to the other, and that's my sort of my entire day like made up. Um, and even in terms of driving, there's also another thing. Sort of being out here, your sense of scale really does change. So even in the UK, it can take you maybe 2 hours to get from like one side of like, let's say, I think it was like mid UK to London and back. Like it takes about 2 hours one way.
And that seems
Whereas
ages. That seems long when you're living in UK.
yeah, that's not the case here. 2 hours, especially in California, gets you absolutely nowhere. You're just still in California. You're still in the city. You haven't left. Like it takes you 6 hours of driving minimum to get from one side of California to the next, and that's one state. So scale is very different over here.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things you hear a lot of people, I think, mistakenly, assuming just because you live in America, especially the people that have lived there their whole lives, they visit different states, and like you're saying, just to go from one state, or one area within a state to another area within that state takes hours. And it is effectively, like different countries. Obviously, it's a lot easier to get into them compared to, let's say, in Europe, but it still takes you so long. And then people in the UK don't even go a few hours, drive to see, famous stuff. So it's like, why would people in America go from New York to, let's say, San Francisco, which is, pretty far away as well?
Yeah, you wouldn't. You would never drive that from New York to San Francisco. That's just way too long. That would take you
Yeah.
weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I remember thinking I think about a few months ago, like how people used to do, cross-state journeys before we had cars or even good cars. When they would be on horses, like
Yeah.
years ago. Like, it was a long journey. Then it wasn't like, oh, it's a weekend journey. It was weeks or even sometimes months, and then they would have to camp out, and it was dangerous because there wasn't proper roads. You didn't know what you was gonna encounter.
Yeah, it was very much a pilgrimage. It was an entire journey. You had to prepare. You had to have a really good reason. I'm
Oh
not even
yeah,
sure what the reason would even be at that point, unless you're doing trade. Because it's not
oh,
like you have like family across the US that you could just casually just go and see.
yeah, unlikely. And even if you did, it'd probably be one of those things where you haven't seen it for 10, 20 years. So it'd be almost like if we have, I'm in the UK, I have family in, somewhere in Asia. It's possible that I don't see them for 10 years. It would effectively be like that, even though it's on on the same landmass. So yeah, it's definitely a strange one. I remember what you were just saying about how rude people are in London. I thought that would be the case for New York, but fair enough. I remember when I moved to London, because I was from the West Midlands, I was a bit more used to people, saying hi, how are you, just random people, and saying it back to them, smiling at them, and just starting a bit of a conversation. And I remember when I got to London, I thought, it's not a fresh start because I know I'm only there for a year, but it's like a new city. I'll try and make an effort. And I remember saying, morning to people, on the underground or walking, all right, how are you? And the amount of times they would clutch their belongings and they would look at me as if I was about to rob them. Like, even though I said morning, how are you? They were looking at me as if I had a balaclava on and I had a gun. I was like, and it was such a strange thing. I quickly realized don't talk to people if you if you don't know them and you ain't got business with them, just don't talk to them in London.
Yeah, so that's very much it. Like everyone just keeps to themselves, and it's just always been like that as far as I can remember. So I think now it's very different for me, but definitely when I was still living there, that would be the strangest thing. It's like, okay, what do you want from me? Why are you? It's almost like this anxiety-inducing moment
Yeah,
when someone comes to talk to you and you just don't really know what to do because you're not sort of trained for it. You just kind of follow everyone else, and if everyone else is just going about their business, you're never going to be the sort of person that stops and has a conversation, or you know. But I think out here, being out here for the last 2 years has definitely taught me, or definitely made me experience the sort of the other side of things, where it's like everyone is super friendly, and you can start strike up a conversation, and it's not weird, and it's not different, and it doesn't have to be a very personal thing. It's just more just so having a conversation and just putting good energy out there and receiving good energy. That's very much something I definitely prefer now. So I'm definitely more comfortable as in London as just striking up a conversation with someone completely random on the street, as opposed to let's say a decade ago. So it's interesting how every sort of city or country sort of develops their culture to you know to be respectful of other people, to have like interactions between each other. It's very very interesting. um yeah.
have you been back to London since you moved over to the US?
I think I try to go back at least once a year. It was certainly easier when I was in New York because it was just only like a 6 hour flight. Whereas right now, to go from San Francisco to London, that's pretty much 12 hours. So I have to like mentally prepare for that, and then you have to prepare for the jet lag. So it's not as easy before. New York, it was like easy to go 2 or 3 times a year, like without a doubt. Whereas right now, to go once, I just try to go at least mandatory every single Christmas. So I'm actually meant to be going back some point next month, I think it is. But yeah, I try to go back once a year, but I wish I can go back more.
How do you find that after living in America, being around American culture, New York, and now especially in California, going back to UK and London? How do you find that? Do you feel like you go back into your old way, or do you kind of, stay in your Californian way, and then you realize, oh, this ain't California anymore. This is London.
I think when I first moved during the early days, it was definitely more of a culture shock to come to the US. Like it's a massive culture shock, having lived in the UK most of my life. And funnily enough, right now it's actually the reverse effect. Every time I go back, it's kind of a culture shock in the wrong way, in the opposite way. Sorry. And one thing that I sort of realized is that when you're out here and you have a British accent, you're sort of like you feel different. And so when I go back, I'm like, oh wait, everyone sounds like me. So I'm like back with my people. um, I don't know if I would go back to my old ways just because it's been so long. I think I've been in the US now for what is at least 8 years at this point. So it's been a while, but I definitely sort of have more fun when I go back. I can appreciate it more. Um, Whereas I feel like when you work and live in a city, you don't really appreciate it. So whenever I go back, I always try to make the most of it. I always try to see as many people as I can. I always like start like just even sometimes do touristy stuff, or sometimes just just be out and enjoy the scenery just for the sake of it. Um, and also, it's just always interesting experiencing like the differences in people and in culture. So in some ways, it definitely is a culture shock every time I go back, especially because I do leave it like once a year. So you go back, you're like, wow, this is really different. Then you come back to the US and you kind of readjust to what life is like, and you almost forget, and you almost like get surprised every time you go back. It's like, oh, this has changed, and especially where I live in London, like the area is always changing around me. So every time I go back, there's like new shops, or there's just this new thing that's been done, or there's like new people around, and it's really in some ways kind of cool going back, knowing that things are always going to be different, and you're always going to see something new. But it's also in some ways kind of sad because you know that the place that you once called home is just drastically changing at every single moment, and you know the home that you were used to, let's say a decade ago, is no longer the home that you see when you go back. So I think that's the sort of the big sort of difference. It's just almost like a reverse culture effect.
So when you went over to America, first time, did you go on your own or did you go with, family, or did you have family there? Like how was that after living in the UK all your life and then going over there?
Good question. I went with, I actually went by myself. So I had a friend from uni that was actually already living in New York. And that was pretty much the only person I knew. I didn't have any sort of family in the US. So it was just looking back, it was kind of like a crazy, hilarious decision. But I guess in the moment it just felt very natural, because in uni you're just used to just sort of like moving around. You switch units every single year where you live, and you just have so much uncertainty. So it just felt like a more natural decision at the time. And when I moved, like I said, it was with my friend from uni. So we were roommates together, and we just that's how we sort of discovered the city. And he eventually moved to San Francisco. And at the time, I had like a few of my friends from uni actually move over here as well. So there ended up being sort of like five of us that sort of moved over and working at different parts of the US and different sort of places. So it didn't necessarily feel like super lonely, or I didn't necessarily feel like I was by myself. But yeah, I think that was pretty much it. I ended up moving with a friend or two.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it definitely helps, when you got somebody there, because they're going through the same thing. It's something new, something different. There, long, they're on their own, and it kind of a relief to know that other people are not necessarily struggling, but that are going through the same thing that you're going through. That it's not just you that might be finding it difficult to transition from London or Nottingham to the US, or how the people are, or how the food is, or how the culture is, or anything. So yeah, it definitely does help. Going back over to when you worked at Slack, what did you specifically work on whilst you were at Slack, and what technologies did you use whilst at Slack as well?
When I moved to Slack, I continued being an iOS engineer. So when I joined, Slack was kind of relatively small. It was about a fifth of the size that it is now, maybe a little bit smaller. I'm not sure. I joined in 2016, so it was like 2 years after they launched Slack, and so our iOS team was relatively small. But to me, it had been the biggest team I'd ever worked in. I think there were 10 iOS engineers at the time, and so when I joined, there were a few projects that were sort of going on. So it's funny because I joined at a time right before we did this whole big transition. We just raised, I think we were right before we were in the process of like raising our next big round. So a lot of things were changing. In terms of technologies, I'd have to go back and sort of remember what exactly were the most innovative things that we were working on. We were trying so many things because we were working on like bots and apps, and we were working on sort of transitioning like different parts of the code base to Swift because it was still Objective C. We were working on a sort of a cross-functional database library sort of thing, which worked between Android and iOS. That was pretty interesting. We were working on sort of making things faster. There were just so many little things that would come up that were really interesting. So one of the things we were working on was moving away from auto layout, actually. So because of where we needed Slack to be in terms of the iOS app, auto layout was just too slow. So we had to build our own sort of component framework that took advantage of, frames and underlying reusage. We had to build our own reuse system. We had to build our own sort of like layout, UI layout system. Um, it was actually a pretty interesting time because so much was changing, and the app was in the MVP state. So our iOS app at one point was just breaking. We just had so many bugs, so many issues. So it was a really interesting time. And then I think a little bit soon afterwards, after I joined, we sort of split up into our product teams. We got to, I think it was like 20 iOS engineers at the time, and we ended up splitting up into five different teams. So I didn't really get to spend too much time like working on the various different parts. At one point, it just once the split happened, I was mainly focused on building out the platform side of things, which was our integrations with sort of like apps, bots, third-party infrastructure, effectively building in a way for developers to really take and make use of Slack, actually. And then there'll be times I'd work on infrastructure stuff. So it was really just really interesting, the kind of stuff we worked on. We made some really interesting progress when it came to infrastructure and how we get the performance out of the app. Because at one point the app was like super slow. We would take in payload. So when you load up the app, it would always in those days, whenever you'd open up the app, it always take around like 5 to 30 seconds, depending on how big your team was, to sort of load up because of how our infrastructure was. We were literally downloading like a 20-30 megabyte file every time you load up the app. It was just not great architecture, but it was expected because of how quickly we had to move, and everything just broke every single time we implemented it. So that was the early days. We ended up innovating and building out one of our most interesting products was Block Kit and App Actions. So which was effectively a way for developers to control UI within Slack or through sort of APIs. So you could, so if you go into Slack and you use any bot, any sort of interaction the bot has within Slack, that all came from the platform team, and we had to build that from the ground up. So if, for example, you wanted to have a bot that, let's say, has a workflow that gives you like, I think a good example is like the Google Calendar. So all of the interactions, whenever you use the Google Calendar bot within Slack, every interactions it was handled by the Block team. So you can effectively take server-side controlled UI components, layer them within a JSON, and send them to the app, and it would have to respond accordingly. So it would handle all of the interactions between the user and the bot and the app. That was a really, really interesting project. And so I spent most of my time, or I guess I think it was about a year working on that specific project. But I really got to see the team grow, and that was probably the most exciting part of being at Slack at that time, because just so much was happening, so much was changing. There was like a new hire almost every single day, and the teams just kept changing. It was fun. It was a good time.
I mean, that's crazy. Like new hire every day. I mean, even if you said every week, that would be insane. Just people coming in all the time. So you seem heavily iOS focused, just throughout your development journey. From what we've discussed so far, why and why not do Android or cross-platform? And do you know any Android dev?
Yeah, I know quite a few Android developers. We worked pretty closely with them at Slack.
No,
But
I actually meant, do you know any Android development? Sorry.
sorry, for you meant developers. I do. I did take a hand at Android development a few years back. I think the reason I stuck with iOS, just because it was the more polished side, in my opinion. It just was really easy to build iOS apps. You didn't have to think about so many things, as opposed to something like Android, where you have to worry about all of these different devices, all of these different screen sizes. And because it's open source, you have just so many things changing. Whereas because iOS was a closed system, there was more consistency, and you can sort of predict exactly how things will turn out, and you just had to focus on building. So I did try my hand at Android. I wasn't, in all honesty, I didn't really like it per se. Um, I think it's just more of like a preference point.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I'm an Android user, but I agree. iOS is more refined. I'll put my hand up and I'll say that every day of the week, because I've got a Samsung Galaxy Z Fold, and I'll use apps all the time from big companies as well. Not even like some small new app from big companies, and I'll use it. And I look at it, I'm like, they just have not, you know, updated the design, or it wasn't dynamically designed well enough to work on, a foldable phone, because it's like a tablet, but it's detecting me as a phone, and then there's certain phone elements that are there that you wouldn't have, let's say, on a tablet, whether that's iPad or Android. And as a result, it's just kind of getting confused. If it serves you the iPhone version, I mean the phone version, it's like it's not using enough real estate. If it serves you the tablet version, yes, it's you know got everything on there, but some things are just a little too small, or just not in the position you would expect them, because you use your phone very different to the way you use your tablet. So yeah, I can see that it's more refined. Every time I use my wife's iPhone, I'm always thinking, I do like how things just work. I do like, which she loves. using my phone just because obviously phones and there's a bigger screen on there compared to getting her tablet. So she uses it and then something just crashes or it just doesn't work. And she's like, what's up? Like, why is it doing this? I'm like, it's fine. Just swipe up, close the app, reload it. That's normal. Just do it. And she was like, don't get this on iPhone. I was like, this is Android. That's as normal as you clicking on iOS. We just have to do a few extra steps now and again. Uh, yeah, but I don't blame you, sticking to iOS. Plus, there's plenty of work effectively, so it's not even like, you need to do both. It's like with web development, you get plenty of people that stick with front end, do very
Yeah.
well. You don't have to go full stack. So, why did you leave Slack? And now to get onto the really interesting stuff, to go and start your own company.
I think the main reason I left Slack, I think it was during the pandemic, and I had gotten my green card, so my permanent residency the year before, and I wanted a new challenge. So I wanted to do something a little bit different. I'd been working within iOS, I'd been working as a developer for a few years at that point, and you know, it was interesting. It was great. Like the thing with iOS, there's just so much to do. That's the thing on the surface. I guess it's mobile development in general, right? That's why if you're an Android developer, especially right now, you're probably going to be doing Android for a while. Like, there's just way too much work. As things get more complex, there's more maintenance required. There's just always stuff that's changing. But yeah, I think in general, the short answer is I felt like I needed a new challenge, and I'd always been entrepreneurial. Like even when I was in university, I just always wanted to do something a little bit different. So I was running a company as well back then, or two, and I always wanted to go back. So my dream was always to start a company in San Francisco, Silicon Valley. That was always like the goal for me. So I'd always been thinking about it, but I wasn't sure when the opportunity would sort of come up. So when the pandemic hit, I figured it would be a good time as ever to try something new, which is probably the reverse, the strangest bit of logic. Hey, we're in a pandemic and things are so uncertain and we don't know what's going to happen. Hey, this is the best time to quit my job and try to start a company. Why not? So I ended up getting a few of my sort of like friends all like together, and we sort of decided to try something different, to look at what we wanted to build as a team, and we just decided to try it. And at the time, it was what I was working on it on the side. So this was probably towards the last few months of my time at Slack, and then we decided to apply to an accelerator, Y Combinator, and we wasn't sure if we really wanted to do it, but we figured why not? It's worth a shot. Let's just try it. It'll be great. It will definitely help out the company. And so we ended up getting in, and they wanted us to be full time. So effectively, it was kind of like a no brainer decision. It's okay. Well, I've been looking for a new challenge. Time to start this company. Like, and I have to go full time. Okay, great. Let me just quit. So they gave us a little bit of money to kind of just start off, and yeah, that was pretty much the reason. Wanted to start a new company, wanted to try something different, and it just felt like a natural decision at the time.
Okay, so you talked about Y Combinator. Like, how was Y Combinator? Because that's like the creme de la creme of incubators. And what did you have to do to get into it? Because I've heard it's got a really rigorous process, and also the acceptance rate is really low as well.
Yeah, I think I heard somewhere that the acceptance rate was like it was like 1% or something like that. Or I don't
It's
know.
super low. It's single digits. So
It,
wherever you read, yeah.
I don't even know. In all honesty, I probably, if I could have made a decision, I would have probably preferred to do Y Combinator in person rather than how we did it, which was remote. Like we were the first remote batch, summer 2020. So that just meant that none of the events were in person. Everything was held over Zoom. And I know there was a thing going around that was like, oh, hey, you can still build like really great relationships on Zoom. And no, it's not the same in any way, shape, or form. So I don't know if I got the full experience of Y Combinator. And in all honesty, we could have probably waited little bit before applying. Um, because the whole process of getting in was really interesting. You submit an application, you present your business case, you present your team, you go through that process. They like your application, then they pull you in for an interview. So we did our application. We got invited to do an interview, and the interview was completely remote. And then that's when everything just got really sort of hectic because we applied with an idea that we'd wanted to do for a while, which was an idea in the music space. So we wanted to redefine how music was being created, and we kind of looked at like all of the software that was around. So I think the biggest one is like Fruity Loops, and there are some applications on Mac and iOS like here and there. But we really wanted to build it from the ground up because this technology has been around for like 30 years, or the products have been around for 30 years, and we kind of believed it was like ripe for disruption. But when we did the interview, the team at Y Combinator, they really did not like the idea. So like I found out later that they just do not mess with like music ideas at all. Like they've been burned way too many times with those sort of ideas. So they really loved our team, but they really hated the idea that we were going after. So they said, "Hey, okay, you know what? Like let's see where you get to. Just like we don't think it's like the right time, but you know what? We really want to see what other ideas you guys come up with. So just like try again." And so, long story short, we ended up having, I think it's rare for like people to get one interview, but we actually ended up having four interviews with them. And we were just like, what is going on? There's no way this is normal. It's insane. Like, we just kept on like speaking with partners, like all the way getting into the batch. And in the end, they sort of like took us in and they're like, hey, like, we're really interested because at the time we were like exploring like a gaming idea, and they were like, we'll take you if you do this gaming idea and like, see where it gets to and X, Y, Z. And so in the end, they were just like, hey, okay, just come in and do this thing. And so we it felt like a very, very interesting and weird experience. Um, just because of all the uncertainty and looking back, not sure why we decided to change the idea. We should have probably just stuck with what we had, but that was pretty much like that experience. Very, very interesting, especially because it was the first time they'd done a remote batch. So it was great. They took on a lot of companies, a lot of great talks, a lot of sort of great advice. You get matched up with a set of partners. So I think they break you up into sub teams. So I think there was like I think at least 250 companies on our batch. They split the entire batch into sort of four groups. So each group is like 50 companies. And so within those groups, those 50 companies are then divided into subgroups, and each subgroup, which is filled with like 4 or 5 companies, maybe six, get matched with 3 partners. And so these are like people who've had like great experience in the industry. So, for example, ours was like 2 of us was like one had like co-founded Twitch. The other one was very like I think the first person to kind of help Yahoo get off the ground. Another person like was what was his thing? Uh, I forget right now, but yeah, you get matched with people that have like great experience in the industry, and that's pretty much the whole batch, and they get you prepared to do demo day, and so that was definitely an interesting experience. Definitely an interesting experience. But I think the one thing that ended up going around about YC at the time, which I've got to experience myself, was that you don't really get as much one-to-one time because as the batch grows and the number of partners don't grow in proportion to the number of like companies in the batch, you don't always get that sort of like that intimate experience, and especially it being on sort of Zoom every day, you don't really get to know the partners, or you don't get to know your batchmates as much. So that's one thing that I sort of didn't really like about the experience, in all honesty.
Okay, so you say you got people from like Twitch and Yahoo. Like, who from Twitch did you get? Was it Justin or was it one of the other founders?
It was one of the other founders, so we were working with Kevin Lin, but we would sync in with Michael Seibel as well. So you pretty much have access to like any of the partners. So once you're in Y Combinator, you can sort of book a meeting with any of the partners or any of the people that run it for specific advice or anything like that.
Okay, that's nice. And how difficult and intense was Y Combinator once you got in there? Because you already said how intense the process was to get in, but once you're in there, what was that like? Like, how long was you in Y Combinator?
I think the entire sort of batch lasts 3 months. It is pretty intense once you're actually in the program itself. You have weekly meetings. You have where you sit with your partners every day, and you're trying to essentially grow this company really quickly, um, and you're really trying to get this thing off the ground, and you have everyone to help you. It's just a really intense 3 months of getting stuff off the ground, and but it was even more intense for us because we came in with like a different idea that we weren't sure that we sort of like came up with on the spot, but we sort of realized like, okay, we don't know if we want to do this, and so we ended up like pivoting throughout the batch. So it wasn't actually, it wasn't actually a really great experience. That made it a little bit more intense than it needed to be. Um, so yeah, to answer your question, it was really, really crazy, really, really intense. Um, yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay, so we've talked about Y Combinator. Let's talk about the company you founded, Icon. What does Icon do?
So we're actually going back into stealth mode. So we tried released our product, and we got like a few beta users. But what we are sort of slightly doing, we're slightly pivoting the idea. So that's why we're going back into stealth mode. But we're focused on being a concierge service for founders. So effectively taking out and automating the day to day activities that people sort of do, because as a founder, when you run a small team, there's just so much to do, and you don't really have time to get to everything. There's like menial tasks, mundane tasks that just take up so much time, especially when you're running a company here in the US, because there's so many forms you need to fill out, there's so many admin things, and that really takes up a lot of time. So we really looked at that area. It's like, okay, well, this is a really interesting place to be. Let's sort of like try to fix this problem. So we're still going through the process of finding that product market fit, uh, but that's the short form. Sorry, I can't give you more than that.
That's fine because I remember I went on the website and there wasn't like a crazy amount of information, but you're still trying to figure things out. You know, so what was the outcome of Y Combinator at the end of the 3 months? Did you raise money for Icon? At the end of Y Combinator, like what happened once the 3 months of Y Combinator were done?
So typically, what happens is you have your business idea, or you have your business, and it's running X, Y, Z. You apply, and you effectively take 3 months to essentially grow that company as quickly as possible. Effectively, make it as attractive to investors as quickly as possible. So you grow as quickly as possible. You grow as much as possible. You try to do the 10x. You try to get the hockey, what they call it, the hockey part, or the hockey chart growth, where everything goes to up and towards the top right. And after those 3 months, you effectively get to do demo day. And when you do demo day, you get to pitch your company, and you get invited to this big thing, and there's thousands of investors, and then you start your raising money phase. So, or I should say your seed stage. Sorry, depending on the company, because some companies they raise their Series A, which effectively is different funding rounds. Every sort of funding stage requires more money, so it depends on the startup and what's best for you. For us, we didn't feel that it was time to do demo day, so we raised a little bit from YC initially. They give you, I think it was 150K at the time. I think they've increased it now to, I think it's 500. Excuse me. But we just decided to sort of defer it. So there's something we found out that you can actually defer demo day. You don't have to raise money after the 3 months. You can sort of take a step back and do it at a point of your choosing. And I think at the time that we decided to defer, that's when things started to be really uncertain with, the fundraising environment, the economy. So we just decided to kind of take a step back rather than raising money straight away. We're going to sort of really work on the product, really make sure that we have the right thing going into market, especially because we are fortunate enough not to need to raise money, particularly in that moment. So for us, once we're ready to sort of like go in and raise money, that's when we'll start. But I feel like one of the big things that I wasn't really too fond of in the process was the force to kind of get out of the door. So get something really quickly and then get out of the door and just raise a bunch of money, because that doesn't always necessarily set you up for success like down the line. And we actually saw like that happen to a bunch of companies that would raise off the wrong idea, and then everything became like a crap show afterwards. So we sort of decided that that wasn't really for us, that we were going to take our time and that we were going to make sure that when we actually wanted to raise, we were going to raise like on our terms with the most leverage as possible. And I think that's something that a lot of founders don't really get the benefit of understanding, especially in the earlier stages. Like this is the first company I've ran in the US, and it's just very different here compared to the UK, where the UK is just very conservative, and everyone has to be like careful, and you wouldn't necessarily raise money until you have like a 30-year profit loss, like you could prove 30 years profit loss. Whereas I think over here in the US, it's just very, very liberal in the opposite way, where you have an idea and people are willing to throw money at you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best decision to take money if you aren't ready for it. So I'm somewhere in the middle, and so after 3 months, we decided that we weren't going to raise money at that moment. We were going to refine our idea and make sure that we had the thing that we were proud of, that we were ready for. So we still have the option of raising money whenever we effectively want. There's a YC event twice a year. So we're not really looking to raise like at this current moment, but probably will do at some point within the next year. Or if the economy gets worse, I don't know.
I mean, that's very interesting to hear that you can do that defer process at Y Combinator, and that the fact that you chose to do that. And I feel like it's probably because you came from the UK that you had a bit more of a different take on it. Because like you said, there's a lot of people there just willing to throw. Obviously, you got to have something about you, but willing to just to throw money at you. And I've seen people. A friend of mine, he's over in the UK, but he raised I think $500,000 because his co-founder was from America, and they was raising it in in dollars, and they raised $500,000, good amount of money for seed round, and it went like within a year or two, it was gone. They wasn't able to raise funding again, and they didn't really like when you saw what they had basically produced with that 500,000. It was like not that much. There was a lot of poor decisions they made. I remember one of the things they hired a lawyer, which basically ripped them off and was charging him. It's something that you see in a movie that he was charging him like so much. Like if you wanted a copy of something, instead of
Yeah.
being like a photocopy of a document, when they're already paying you thousands or tens of thousands, you should just be free in reality, because we're not talking about thousands of couple talking about one or two, and he was charging like maybe a tenner or something, something ridiculous for like a copy, and then he was doing documentation, but it was just templates he was getting off the internet and charging in the thousands for it, and just stuff like that they just assumed, oh, he'll be good, paying him a good amount of money, he should know what he's doing. So yeah, it's definitely interesting to hear that you can do that. If you do decide to raise, let's say in a year or 2 year, do you have to go back to Y Combinator? Are you like in contract that you have to go and do a demo and raise with them, or can you just say, I've got someone else to in line? Maybe you meet someone, an investor.
Not necessarily through our company, but just a point, just on your earlier point. I think that actually happens more frequently to startups than most people believe, because the kind of the narrative that's painted, especially here in Silicon Valley, is that, oh, you start a startup, you raise a bunch of money, and then you exit and then you make a bunch of money. But the vast majority of companies actually go through that process, especially first-time founders. You raise money when things are uncertain, and you sort of go through that process. You don't really know what you're doing with the money, and before you know it, the money sort of runs out, because once you raise, a good amount of money, this coming from the UK, this is kind of like an absurd amount of money. I remember when I first sort of came into it, it's an absurd amount of money to raise something of very little traction or very little proof, because I remember when I had a company in the UK, and even trying to raise like 25K for that was just like, it was insane what we had to do. You had to do less for like Y Combinator to kind of raise that sort of money. And so learning about that and that process, it was a very different experience. And maybe it is the fact that coming from the UK and that kind of the way the experience of running previous companies had like taught me coming into this. But 500K is actually not that much in comparison, because you have companies out here that raise sort of like $10 million off a pre-seed idea, barely have an idea. And everything just goes. Everything just expires, and then they're just having to run around for a few years before they figure it out. And I guess investors here are okay with that. They're okay with investing in people who can run around for a few years before they figure it out. But that story of you raise some money over hire, like even with us, like we ended up hiring pretty early on, and then sort of realizing that it wasn't the right time to hire, and so we had to like slim down the team. And that was all because like we raised a little bit of money. And I think that first experience of raising venture capital in the US sort of made me realize that, okay, yeah, we should only really do this if we know exactly what we're doing, because I'm not too comfortable sort of taking in like a whole bunch of money and just like wasting it, or just like putting it towards the wrong resources. So that story actually happens so much. And if it's funny how many founders look back and always like wish that they were making better or smarter decisions, or even if the fact that you take a little bit more time to really think about what you want to do, or even making sure that you have more leverage going into these situations, because just because you can raise the money doesn't mean that you should. And just because in these situations, once you do have a name like Y Combinator on your sort of your company sort of like brand, people come up to you and they'll say, okay, hey, like we write like $1 to $2 million checks, like let us know how much you want. And it can be really tempting to just kind of take it because you think that the money is going to help you across your journey. But we found out early on that the money really wouldn't help, and it's better to sort of bootstrap and really, really take it and be more intentional the first few years rather than just kind of going all in and just running with it. Because I have a bunch of friends right now that are running like some are running really successful companies. Like my friend's company just raised, I think it was like a few months ago, they raised like $100 million round. So it's like you see the successes, but you also see the failures, and you sort of contrast the two, and you realize that the people that like end up really being successful from it are the people who take their time and sort of have been doing this for like a lot longer, and sort of like think things through way earlier in the process. I mean, there's always the odd case where it just happens to work out the very first time, but there's always that disclaimer. So in short, that story about your friend and the 500K, that happens a lot more frequently than most people let on. But yeah, sorry, to answer your question, when we do raise, I think we don't have to do it through YC. I think the way it works is that it's a deal. So when you apply through YC, they give you, it's kind of changed now. They've increased it to 500K. But for the terms that we initially applied with, it was 150K for 7% and access to demo day. So they take 7% of your company, they give you $150,000, and you have this option to be introduced to investors at any time that you wish. You only get one. So as a company, you only get one chance to do it. You only get one chance to do demo day for that particular batch whenever you apply. And that's, as far as I know, always going to be there as long as the company exists. So it doesn't have to be with Y Combinator. So let's say tomorrow decide to do a fundraise. Yeah, let's say I decide to do a fundraise tomorrow. I can choose to do it completely independently. So I can get VCs in the area. I can find a network of VCs and start the fundraise that way. So it doesn't have to be all Y Combinator demo day ends up being is just a way to introduce you to like all of these different investors. But if you already have the network, then you don't necessarily need to go through Y Combinator, if that makes sense. So there's no contractual agreement. It's just more so an option. It helps the fundraise it helps make the fundraise slightly easier. But you still have to go through the process. So once you do get those intros, you still have to set up the meetings. You still have to have like 80 to 100 calls like every week. So that's pretty much it.
Okay, so that's good to hear that you can, go to the investors. So you're saying you give Y Combinator 7%. Like, what does that 7% actually mean? Because imagine if, let's say, you are, running this company, you start to make a bit of money, you decide not to raise, and let's say you're just making, let's say there's 5 of you in there, including yourself, just making enough, and then let's just put a, figure out there, 50 grand each. You're just making enough to, live each. Like, is Y Combinator going to be like, we want, what, to 250 times 5, 250, we want, 7% of that, which is what, 17.5 grand or something? Would they come knocking for that, or is there some conditions around what that 7% actually means?
Oh, yeah, good question. Actually, no, they wouldn't. The way the 7% works, and I think the scale they operate at, they won't care about a few thousand in any way, shape, or form. Like even if you're a company that just sold for $50 million, they probably wouldn't even care to chase up. Like they only care about the $1 billion companies. So everything they give you is just for you to have a shot at becoming a $1 billion company. They really make their money in two ways. One is through exits. Actually, so that's really the main thing. They just hope you exit as a startup. So they don't really care how much revenue you make on a day-to-day basis. So even if you're a startup that's making $1 million a year, that's really nothing to them. They care about you making billions of dollars every single year. So if you happen to either get bought or go public, those are really the two main ways. So an example is Airbnb. Airbnb went through Y Combinator. They took an initial investment. That 7%, at the start, which was, it's only 7% of the company. I think the company's valued at $2 million once you go through YC. So the equity is worth, I can't remember the math, but like I think it's like 100, yeah, exactly 150K, roughly about that much. And then once the company raises a few rounds, the valuation goes up. So a company like Airbnb, when they IPO'd, I think they've IPO'd at like $100 billion. So that 7%, even with dilution, ended up being worth like a few billion. So that's how they make their money. They don't really care about the day-to-day profits. I think the way it works over here is that 7% is more so the valuation of the company. So it's whatever the company is valued at, they own that. So it's like an asset to them. So they don't really care about the dividends or a cut of the profits. It's just really, if you sell or you go public, that's when we cash in our cut. That's when we have like a percentage of the company. So it really just operates like a venture capital firm.
Okay, yeah, yeah, that's good to hear because I'm sure there's companies that have gone through Y Combinator that haven't made it big, but they haven't failed, and they're just doing a good amount of money for the founders and maybe for a few employees. The last thing you want is Y Combinator to come knocking and be like, you've got 4 years, back pay, you're
Yeah.
50 grand, and they're like, we ain't got that money. So yeah, I mean, it's good to hear that they're like, obviously on the numbers they're operating on, it's probably costing them more to actually send people, to chase you, to get the lawyers and all that stuff. And on top of that, it doesn't look good when they're doing, deals with Airbnb and other big companies through their Y Combinator program. It's just not worth chasing even if probably a few $100,000 for Y Combinator. And I'm guessing that's probably the same with other venture capital, capital firms or angel, you know, investors and also advisors that they're really more just there for the exit than your day to day profit, running.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. They just don't. It's just too much effort for them. They don't really care, and I think it's one of the first things that they tell you. They're like, hey, like we're not going to ask for this money back. Whatever you want to do with it, you do with it. We invest in you as people, so you know you don't need. They're never going to ask for you back. They would rather you spend every single penny trying to get a shot at becoming $1 billion company than you try to save anything. I think that's actually the story of like how Slack became Slack as well, because Slack used to be a game. I don't know how many people know that. Probably anyone that's into startups knows, but Slack actually used to be a game. It used to be this game called Twitch, and they were working on. I think it was Twitch. I think it was Twitch. Yeah, they were working on it for like 5 years, and it just wasn't going anywhere. So they built this internal tool, which was chat. Ended up becoming Slack like later on, but they built an internal tool, Slack, and they had raised money on the game. And I think they had like, I can't remember how much they raised, but they had something like $12 million left, or I think it was like they had a few million left from the initial sort of deal that they did before. And so they went back to the investors like, hey, this game isn't working. Like, here's the $12 million back. And the VCs were just like, we don't want it back. Why don't you just keep trying? Like what? Like we don't the money. Like we take on the money so we can invest it into companies. So they gave they tried to give the 12 million back. They were like, nope, you continue. And so they were like, okay, let's just try to release this internal tool that we've been building for a while. And then the rest is history. Then it ended up working out. Whereas I think in other places and other sort of like cities or other sort of like startup environments, that isn't the case. So Y Combinator is not different. If you have, they'll rather you spend every little bit of penny rather than you trying to save a few thousand. Even if you only spend 50K and you can give them back 100K, it's like nope, you figure out a way to make it back. I don't know. Even if you burn it, it doesn't matter. Like they take on hundreds at this point. Let's say they take on 200 companies every batch. Every batch they do 2 batches a year. If they take on 200 companies, they don't care about losing money on 199 of those companies as long as one company becomes $1 billion company because that pays for everybody else. So that's kind of the logic there. It's almost like put your egg in all these baskets. One will become like a unicorn and pay for everybody else. So that's how they see it. That's why they don't really care to ask for the money back.
I mean, yeah, when you put it like that, it doesn't really matter if they are getting those unicorns or those decacorns, every batch or every few batches, it really doesn't matter. So, talking about Icon, how many co-founders, do you have, including yourself?
Three co-founders in total, including myself.
Okay, and did you, meet them before? Like, how did you meet them? Like, did you meet any of them in Y Combinator?
No, these were actually friends from uni, from college. Like we all
Okay,
moved over
so
to the US, and that's how
oh,
we started the company.
it was those friends that you mentioned that came with you to the US. Is it those friends?
Yeah, exactly. That's how we
Okay,
started.
okay, that's good. And so, when can we expect Icon to, launch something public facing?
Good question. We're still working through the sort of process. I think right now with so much uncertainty with the economy and the state of things, we're sort of really trying to analyze and monitor like the situation. But we're hoping to get something out soon by Q1 of next year, which is like before like March. That's when we hope to kind of get the product out. So we're sort of like iterating, working with our sort of beta users, and just figuring things out, making sure that we have the right sort of foot forward when we decide to take the company a little bit further, decide to sort of go through the process, start the fundraise, grow, all of that good stuff.
Okay. And like right now, because you're focusing on this, as far as I know, you don't have another job. Like, are you just operating on that 150K that you got from Y Combinator, or are you operating on savings? Like, how are you as a team basically surviving?
A little bit of both, a little bit of both. So savings, a little like the money from Y Combinator. So just essentially just bootstrapping the whole thing. Um, don't expect to be doing that for too much longer, but that's kind of the state of things right now. It's just what I've learned in the past makes the most sense if you're kind of in this phase, because if you take on too much money, it ends up biting you in the ass like later on. So
Yeah.
bootstrapping in short.
Okay, and like, how have your, not the friends that you started the company with, but how have other friends, either from the UK or the ones you made in the US, and how have family sort of reacted to you leaving companies that were probably paying well? You're over in the US, you got these nice roles, and then going starting your own thing and kind of bootstrapping it now, and also not turning down Y Combinator, but deferring it.
Well, my parents for sure, they think I'm crazy. They're just like, wait, what? Wait, why don't you just keep working? Like, why are you doing this really crazy thing that makes no sense to anybody? Why don't you? Because they're in a generation above, so for them, stability is everything to be
Yeah,
desired. You work the 9 to 5, you work the traditional job, and you do that for 4 years, and then you retire to a good life. And in some ways, that's pretty much something that does make sense. But I think for me, I'm just always someone that likes to try new things and always like to be challenged. I think it depends. I have different friendship groups, around me. So I have friendship groups in the UK, friendship groups in the US. I think in the UK, I don't really know too many people that are doing startups. So the friends I grew up with, they are sort of always like, well, good luck, man. I hope everything works well.
yeah,
But they obviously don't necessarily understand why I would be doing this sort of thing. When it comes to in the US, especially, I think it's more accepted here in San Francisco. So everyone's like, okay, yeah, like everyone's trying to help each other because everyone knows how hard it is, and everyone sort of gets the whole startup environment. So I guess it really just depends. Some people, but I think that from the friends that don't understand it, they really don't understand it, and then from the
Yeah.
friends that do, they understand it. So it's very hard to find that kind of in between. So sometimes when I say that, hey, I can't really, hang out today, or I can't do this because I'm busy or I'm working on the weekend, you have some people that are like, wait, why? You don't take breaks on weekends? And it's like, no, it's like a start. Why would I take a break on the weekend? Um, but I take breaks on weekends. It's just like sometimes when things get hectic, this is the thing you have to focus on. There's no PTO, there's no paid time off. If you stop, anything can happen. So many things are changing, and I think people just don't understand sometimes the time commitment that it sort of takes, or the sort of sacrifices that you have to make in sort of different departments, or you know around that. So I
Oh
think in
yeah,
short,
for
some
sure.
people understand it, others don't.
Yeah, and because I've never done it before, or I'm guessing you've had this, it's your own business, so just take time off whenever, and it's like money's not rolling in, at least not yet. The work's only gonna get done if I do it. Or I remember hearing before when I was doing stuff. Oh yeah, just finish the work, early on, and then chill later in the day. And it's like there isn't. It's not like a regular company where if I get this, work done, I'm done for a couple of days or a day or so. It's if I get it done, great. I can move on to the next task. It- that's the way it is. It's less about stretching the work out and passing the time until you clock off at 5, and it's more like, okay, if I'm only working till let's say 5, 7, 10, or whenever the time is, can I quickly get this done by 10 a.m.? Can I do the next thing by 11, 12, 1, whatever it is? So yeah, it's definitely something that people just don't understand. Um, so
Yeah, it's like it defies all logic,
mm,
because you go in, and most startups don't make any money for years. You have all these various examples. Even Facebook didn't make money for 7 years, and effectively you're just doing this thing in hopes that it works out. And really, you have about maybe a 5% chance at best. I've heard 10% being thrown around, but really you have a really small chance of success, and you're essentially working for years on end, and you don't know if this thing is going to work out. There's no money to be made. You just left this comfortable tech job, and when and people just don't really understand that, because it just doesn't really. You have to have a really strong reason for why you're doing it, and I think most people just wouldn't do it, as rightfully so, because it just it just doesn't make any sense, in all honesty. But that's kind of the main thing. Just don't make money for just long periods of time, and you have to be okay with that.
yeah, and it must be alien to other people, especially when maybe they're not now, but when you was earning money from Slack and Giphy, because I know how those companies pay. They pay well, and it must people must think you've quit those well-paying jobs where you had so much money, you could do this, and that to do your own thing, which is uncertain, and raising money. Yeah, it must just be crazy for them because they're thinking, "Oh, love to be on that salary, love to work for a company like that. That's exciting and it's moving fast." But people that don't have that sort of fire in them and desire to do something, they don't understand that it's like a child. Like you're gonna protect your child, you're gonna want to raise it well. It's the same as that. You want to give it your best.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think
Yeah,
that's
and
exactly it. Yeah.
how many employees, excluding the co-founders, does Icon have currently?
We're back to the co-founders. So we hired, I think it was 6 initially, and then sort of realized that that doesn't really work for us for the scale that we're operating at. So we sort of cut early, and so it's just founders at the moment.
Okay, and so talking about when you had the 6, and it kind of now as well. Does Icon do remote or on-site working?
So it's all remote right now. It's all remote, no on site. I think it's actually more efficient to do a remote in the early stages. So yeah.
Okay, and before we wrap up, I got two last questions. Biggest regret as a developer?
Biggest regret as a developer.
Yeah.
Oof. I'd probably say not exploring other areas of software development as much. So
Okay.
I wish I was proficient at many different areas. Well, I guess it's hard to do. It's hard to regret as a developer because you always have the opportunity to get proficient. So I don't know if that's a very good one, in all honesty.
Yeah.
Um,
Plus, you've done
so
well by focusing on iOS, for example. So it's not
yeah,
like it's been detrimental in terms of career because your career was progressing fine. It's not like your manager will say, "Oh yeah, we would have given you the promotion if you were the good Android dev as well." It's just you just iOS. So yeah, it's an interesting one. That is.
yeah, it's really hard because I don't know if I have any specific regrets being a developer. I think I've been fortunate enough to have a pretty consistent sort of journey in terms of how I've enjoyed the process. Like I've enjoyed every single moment of it, and I think learning to code was one of the greatest experiences of my life. It was one of the best experiences. So I don't know if there's anything in particular that I regret, especially because I'm still learning every day and I'm still, you know, making what I believe to be the best use of it. So I don't know if there's any regrets, to be honest.
Okay. And what advice would you give as a developer to someone that's looking to become a developer themselves?
Good question. I think it depends on what the outcome is. If the outcome is to work at a tech company, the advice is very different to someone that actually wants to be, you know, really in tune with building stuff and being a developer. I think if you want to be a developer to work at a company, I think it's best to sort of start small. I think in both cases, it's to start small, start with kind of learning like the basics. It's better to be good at like one thing than trying to be average across all these different sort of departments. It's really just best to choose one area, get really good at that, and kind of like really lean into that skill. Because the thing about development is that whether you go for like web, iOS, Android, you go into crypto, you go into AI, all of these things are just what feels like infinite wells of knowledge where you can spend years, an entire lifetime in any of these categories and still feel like you don't know everything. And so starting small, choosing an area that makes the most sense for you, and really just exploring and taking the time to get really good at that particular thing. Um, and I think that's the easiest way to get to a company. I think it depends on whether you have a computer science degree or not. I think that's even becoming less relevant now in today's age. But working on projects, I think this is where it leans more into if when you're trying to be like a good developer, you're trying to get really in touch with, building and releasing projects. You just kind of have to build things that you care about, and you have to really really good at understanding the fundamentals of how these things work, like get really good at getting in depth into some of these things. Because taking that extra time to, let's say I have a feature, I want to build this app that helps me find restaurants around the area that I live in. It's easy to think that you can build the app, and like as long as it works, it's fine. But if you really want to get good and you really want to be a good developer, you have to sort of take the time to understand how these things work. How can it be improved? How can you make it so that it can add more features, or how do you make it more efficient? How do you make it so it's easier to collaborate with other people on that project? As you start to think about those specific things, that's how you get better. So there's the point of getting in, which is starting small, choosing an area that you really care about and really understanding it from a high level, but then really sort of challenging yourself with everything that you build or everything that you think about. That's how you get into like the top, like 1% of like developers, because that's how you always improve. The top 1% of developers aren't there because of like natural ability. It's just all because they put in the work to actually really consistently push themselves in all these different aspects of what it takes to be a developer.
Some great advice there. And actually, before we wrap up, there's a fun generic question, a bunch of fun generic questions that I'd like to ask, but I want to just ask this particular one. Does money buy you happiness? I want to hear your response to
Absolutely not.
that.
And it makes the journey seem easier. And I think if you are someone that didn't necessarily grow up around money and then you get money, it can be easy to think that money will solve all of your problems, but it doesn't. And especially in tech, this is the thing, because tech jobs are associated with being really well paid, and you get this like amazing lifestyle, but it also comes at a sacrifice. And if you are doing something for the money that you don't enjoy, I mean, there's always that person that loves money to the point where like they could do anything as long as there's a paycheck. But I think for someone like me, I have to have purpose and intention behind whatever I'm doing. So if you're doing something that you don't love, but you're getting paid a lot for it, eventually you will burn out, and eventually you will leave that thing, because money, there's only so many things in this world that you can buy. I think if you ask the average person what they want, it's a pretty much finite list of things that people can buy. Like, if you ask a person right now, okay, what do you want to make you happy? Oh, I want to buy a house, or I want to buy a particular car, or I want to buy these material things, or I want to go on these holidays. That's a finite list that can be solved with a specific amount of money. And once you get that amount of money, you kind of realize that your goals are probably too small. And the things that will actually bring you ultimate happiness in this life, and I speak for myself, are the things that you can't put a price tag on, because eventually all these things that you think will bring you happiness, you will get those things, and then you'll probably still be unhappy. I think that's for the average person. So to answer the question, I definitely don't believe that money brings you happiness. It does bring you some kind of comfortability to give you options, but I think money is just really a tool, and the more of it, the more you have of it, the more of a tool it becomes. And but if you sort of center your life around, money will make me happy, you will never be happy. Like, there are so many people, even in tech, who have absurd amounts of money, but they don't know what to do with it. One, because they are working overtime, or because you're just in an environment where you may have a lot of money, but then the people around you don't have a lot of money, and you actually end up becoming more sad as a result of it. Just simply because, I know this is getting really deep, but you actually get more sad because you can't. The whole point of having money is to enjoy it with the people around you. And when you can't do that, when you're not enjoying it yourself, or when you realize that money can't solve root causes like health or relationships, or there are just, like they would say, the grass is not greener. And it's better to find happiness internally and have money be a result of your happiness, as opposed to a means to maintain or get that happiness, because you will never find it through just money itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a good deep answer, but I love it. I always like to ask every person that I have on this some question like that, especially like, does money buy you happiness? You get all sorts of responses. But yeah, definitely love the answer, and all the questions done now, or at least the main ones that I wanted to ask you. Just want to thank you know Stephen for coming on. Do you have anything else to say? Before we wrap up for the audience.
No, this has been great. This has been a great conversation. Really great questions. Hopefully, I gave some really good answers. Nothing else to really say. If anyone wants to follow me or the journey, feel free to hit me up, ask me any questions. Always available for that. Always happy to help.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, the answers were great. Definitely a lot of insight, especially the fact that you went to Y Combinator, because I've had other people, but they may not have had that specific journey, or they've worked at a big company, let's say like Amazon or Intel, for example, but they're just an employee. They even if they're high up, so having that unique experience is great. So I'll get all the links off Stephen. His social, Icon website, anything that he wants to share, or put that in the description, so you can hit him up, see what he's up to. And I'd love to have you on again sometime, especially when you do launch sometime next year. So we'll have something new and fresh to talk about. And again, just want to thank you for coming on, Stephen. It was great having you on. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye.